Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Reference Point. I'm your host, Dave Kocharhook, and I'm back again with Dr. Stephen Tower from Anchorage, Alaska, and we're taking on additional conversation regarding the topic of implants, hip and shoulder implants. And the reason we're doing this is because there's a challenge, and that has to do with the type of metal that's dominantly used in hip and shoulder implants, which is a chrome cobalt alloy. And Dr. Tower was telling us about some of his personal experience and what he's seen with a number of his patients with regard to what was referred to as cobalt toxicity. So, Dr. Tower, welcome back to Reference Point. Thank you for joining us again for this second episode.
Again, it's a pleasure to be with you.
Well, I want to kind of pick up where we left off from the last show. We were talking about the fact that this is something that has been a problem area that you had experienced personally, but in the last few years where you've been doing some research on this in conjunction with a colleague, where you've really been able to demonstrate with some real clear visual components how the brain is being affected and absorbing some of this cobalt. So how did that process come about where you started to do the scans?
Well, 3.5 years ago, I'd been part of a very successful group practice up here, and my partners were none too pleased with me making all these waves and jousting with multi-billion-dollar implant manufacturing companies. So they kind of told me, gee, Steve, if you want to do that, you're welcome to do it on your own, but you can't do it under our roof. So I had to go into solo practice, and that meant moving my office into the Lake Otis medical building, which had an imaging center in it. And being in a solo practice, I didn't have any imaging capabilities in my own office, so I got to know the radiologists, Dr. Bob Bridges and Dr. Mark Beck, quite well. And at that time, when patients would come to me, and at this time we were still really focused on these metal-on-metal hips, which are basically falling out of favor, but 1 million were done, and there's a lot of patients still out there with those joints that are in trouble and aren't being, in my opinion, appropriately monitored. And I was sitting next to Bob Bridges looking at one of these metal suppression MRIs of a hip to determine as to whether or not the patient had metal debris at the hip that was damaging the tissues around the hip.
Right.
Similar to what had occurred to me personally and resulted in me losing all the ligaments around my hip. So when I did get my hip redone, I was kind of condemned to have 9 dislocations of my revised hip before it finally scarred in. And I can tell you, when you dislocate your hip, you're pretty much dead in the water. When that happens to me, I go down like a pile of bricks, and you just kind of lay there on the floor until someone comes, picks you up, and takes you to the hospital to get it popped back into the socket. I have incredible empathy for my patients that have experienced hip dislocations.
I'll bet you do.
But we were looking at this MRI of the hip, and I was relating to Dr. Bridges the story of these neurologic complaints that I personally experienced, and many of my patients mentioned the forgetfulness and the fatigue. A lot of patients develop a tremor. We've had some patients develop outright Parkinson's disease. Ringing in the ears and deafness is a common complaint. Subtle visual changes are fairly common, and I actually experienced retinopathy myself and lost a little bit of retina in one eye. Peripheral neuropathy, numbness and tingling in the hands and feet. And the mood lability, like I experienced, and particularly forgetfulness is a very common early complaint. And of course, when people complain of that in an elderly population, everyone just says, well, you're just getting old. This happens as we age.
Right.
It happened to me when I was 50. I didn't think I should be experiencing it that soon.
That actually generates a question for me that sometimes I want to ask these things so I don't not ask them later, and that is do we see hip replacement activity more in an older population than in a middle-aged population, or is it pretty well spread out and it's just whatever, based on lifestyle?
I think the mean age of someone who gets their hip replaced in the United States is right around 65.
Around 65. Okay, so that makes sense.
It's a skewed curve. There's many more patients who get it replaced later in life than earlier in life, and largely it's because the most common cause of someone needing a hip replacement is osteoarthritis.
Oh yeah, right.
Which is progressive with age.
And then that makes sense why people might then think that those symptoms that you were talking about, the tremors and the forgetfulness and the vision, all that sort of stuff, would be, oh, I'm just getting older. But that's really, if they've had a chrome cobalt replacement of a hip or a shoulder, then there is a possibility that there is something else going on.
And there's a condition, as I understand the cobalt systemic toxicity better, it makes sense in my mind, and we're focusing on the nervous system, both the peripheral nerves and the brain. And I believe from my experience, it's really the most common presentation with the cobalt toxicity involves the nervous system. Right. But it's also well known to affect the heart, and people can get a cardiomyopathy from cobalt. And I personally experienced the cardiomyopathy in addition to the neurologic complications.
So you had the whole spectrum. Lucky you. You got to experience it all.
Yeah, well, I think in my 12 symptom inventory for the neurologic problems, I experienced 10 of the 12.
Oh, wow.
And again, it was, in my case, I was the canary in the mine.
Yeah.
I had an implant that was metal on metal. Its design made it particularly prone towards edge loading. Mm-hmm. And I was a particularly active individual that really put it through a lot of cycles. And fortunately, I had the medical background and a research interest in hip replacement that I was able to actually recognize the problem. But even having recognized the problem, I couldn't really believe it myself or convince anybody else to believe it until I had the hip removed and all these problems went away.
You had mentioned earlier that there was something like 1 million people who have had this similar type of, was it the similar type of implant that you had, or?
Yeah, about 1 million patients in the United States had the metal on metal hip, which includes hip resurfacing. It includes about 90,000 of us that had the DePuy ASR XL, which is probably the worst of the worst. And initially, when I described this problem, I believed and everybody else believed that, well, hopefully it's only the DePuy XL ASR hip that's going to have this problem. But within a year of understanding the problem and experiencing it myself, I was seeing it very commonly in patients that had other brands of the metal-on-metal hip.
Got it.
Maybe not occurring as quickly as mine did, and maybe not to the same degree of severity. And those other brands have kind of silently been taken off the market. It was only the DePuy ASR XL that was formally recalled from the market.
Right.
Strangely enough, metal-on-metal hip resurfacing is still done in the United States. It has all of the same problems. The reason some surgeons are still doing it and the reason the companies continue to market it is that particular device went through the full pre-market approval process, which gives the companies this preemption protection from being sued.
I want to make sure, I'm going to interrupt you right there, make sure that the folks who are watching know that what we're talking about with the pre-approval process, that has to do with the Food and Drug Administration's process that they work with a medical device company where there's testings and reviews and whatnot, and then they give a blessing for this new product to go out on the market. Is that nice?
Yeah, and I would recommend any of your audience that's interested in this, go ahead and go to Netflix and watch The Bleeding Edge.
Right.
because they have some wonderful graphics that describe both the pre-market approval process that does involve some testing, but not anywhere near to the degree of the testing that pharmaceuticals are subject to.
Right.
But 98% of the hips that people are walking around on were approved by an alternate process called the 510K pathway, which involves no testing.
Right.
The companies just have to show that the device or the changes to the device reasonably resemble a predicate device, which may no longer be used because it didn't work well.
Yeah, but that but again, it doesn't matter whether it worked or not because they're able to use this loophole in order to get that out. And then that's a topic I want to talk a little bit more about. But before we do, how many people do you think, you mentioned 1 million that had the metal on metal similar to the scenario that you had experienced. But now that there's been this adjustment and but there's still a lot of chrome cobalt balls and sockets on a stem that might be titanium. So what is the population that has a challenge, do you think?
Well, I think over the past 20 years, probably close to 10 million Americans have had their hips or shoulders replaced. And the majority of those devices have used a chrome cobalt ball articulating on a plastic socket. So that's the metal on plastic hips. And they're much safer than the metal on metal hips. But what I've learned over the past 3.5 years, now that we have this sensitive brain scan tool to demonstrate the cobalt encephalopathy or the effect of cobalt on the brain, or specifically the rate that the brain uses glucose, I'm finding many of my patients with metal on plastic hips and shoulders that were never thought to be a problem, that these patients do have some symptoms, some elevation in cobalt. And their brain scans also show this picture of widespread brain hypometabolism, a decreased rate of glucose use, but in a very specific pattern that we have seen in the metal on metal patients.
If someone is experiencing some kind of a challenge, or if someone has had a shoulder or hip replacement sometime, any time, maybe it's a year ago, maybe it's 5 years ago, maybe it's 15 years ago, would it be prudent for them to go and test to see if there's cobalt in the urine?
I think what I do, or I can tell you what I do in my own practice, if a patient crosses the threshold to be seen by me to be evaluated for any problem, and I take a history and find out they have a hip or a shoulder replacement, I'm experienced enough that usually by x-ray I can recognize the parts and pieces and know whether or not they are at risk. I consider anybody with a hip or a shoulder that has a chrome cobalt part to be at risk. And this is the huge change here, because before we only thought those large number of patients, but a minority of patients with the metal on metal hips were at risk.
How does one know whether you've had a chrome cobalt component in the implant?
Well, I can say if it's a shoulder replacement, it's 99% certain you have a chrome cobalt part, because there are options out there to do a shoulder without a chrome cobalt ball, but it's kind of reserved for patients who are known to be allergic to chrome cobalt. And it's not terribly commonly done. The surgeon has to request it special. Whereas in the hips, for about 20 years, even a little longer, we've had the option of using a ceramic head instead of chrome cobalt head. And that's been fairly commonly used. But if you look at the last 20, and it's becoming, with people being to realize that chrome cobalt is a potential problem, use of the ceramic head is becoming more common. But still, it's about 50-50 in the United States. Pretty much anyone who's Medicare population, almost guaranteed you're going to get a chrome cobalt head because it's less expensive.
Than the ceramic?
And the hospitals get paid a fixed amount of money by Medicare for hip replacement. So if the surgeon is putting ceramic heads in all their patients, they're likely getting some calls from their hospital administrators saying your implant bill is busting the institution. But the ceramic heads have become more popular in the younger population. But of the 10 million Americans living today on that order that have a hip or a shoulder replacement, probably close to 80% have an at-risk implant.
Have an at-risk. So what should they do? What should they do?
Well, if they're experiencing any of these neurologic symptoms, which the way I ask my patients these questions, I say, well, considering we are all getting older, are you experiencing more forgetfulness than you would expect? You're getting older. You probably don't have the energy level you used to, but do you think your fatigue is beyond what you would expect for normal aging? And that's the process I go through for all 12 symptoms of the cobalt encephalopathy. And regardless, it's now my practice that any patient that I know has an at-risk implant, shoulder or hip, and that's most patients that have received replaced shoulder or hip, I get a urine cobalt. You can get it at almost any lab. I prefer to get it at a Quest lab. I don't have any interest in Quest. It's just they'll measure and report a cobalt level down to a level of 0.2 parts per billion, and they'll do the same in blood. I don't get a blood level unless the urine level is elevated, and I'm only still getting blood levels mainly out of academic interest because my work so far suggests that a urine level is more valuable than a blood level, and it doesn't involve sticking the patient with a needle. Right.
Now, you had mentioned, I think, previously, and I just want to restate this, though, that if an at-risk patient who does replace the chrome cobalt implant, that the symptoms will remediate without a lot of additional effort from the patient. They don't have to take some kind of medication. They don't have to do some blood something where it goes through some kind of a sieve or something. It's just like it'll fix itself.
Yeah, you pee it out. The kidney clears cobalt. What happens when people have an implant that's wearing excessively or corroding, there's a positive cobalt balance in the body. Your cells start to absorb it. You're peeing it out, but you're not peeing out as much as is being produced by the corroding or excessively wearing implant.
Right.
And gradually it accumulates in the cells. And that's where the toxicity is manifested. It's a mitochondrial toxin. It affects highly metabolic cells. So you're talking neurons, which make up the brain. You're talking the muscle cells in the heart.
Right.
And once you get rid of the source of the cobalt, the blood and urine levels tend to go down fairly rapidly, almost exponentially.
Well, that's good.
And I would say in my own personal experience, within a month of surgery, a lot of my neurologic symptoms had improved. The more severe the toxicity, the unfortunate patients we have that are deaf and blind, their recovery is much more prolonged, and they may only get partial recovery. Dr. Bridges, who is really the reason we started doing the FDG PET brain scans, he's done some real heavy thinking and research on this, and what we see in the brain on FDG PET brain scan, this diminished use of glucose by the brain in general, but in a pattern which is very specific, is not only seen with cobalt, it's also seen with chemotherapy for cancer.
Oh, my.
It's also seen with other heavy metals like lead and mercury and manganese, and with solvent exposure.
Huh.
And when we see that particular pattern in the brain, it falls into a larger category called chronic toxic encephalopathy. So it's a toxin related, and there's different stages. And most of the patients we've studied, when we look at the CT scan part of their brain scan, their brains look fairly normal.
Mm-hmm.
When we see the metabolic part of their scan, their brains are very abnormal. So that's a stage 2. And our concern is we do have some patients that are starting to show loss of brain volume.
Oh,
and
yeah,
once
that's no
that
fun.
occurs and you start losing neurons, then you're probably less likely to experience full reversibility.
Right. I have another question for you here. And this is, clearly you've been able to document and demonstrate this problem. And it's not just you that's been doing, I guess you're sort of at the forefront of it. But what is the orthopedic community and the prosthetic community, how are they responding to this knowledge?
Well, and I've had experience with that now for 10 years, because even before I had my hip redone, I'm pretty well connected, because I'd done research on orthopedic implants. I've never done it for money or done it on a company's dime, but I've always been interested in it. And I've had this research collaboration with Dartmouth Biomedical Engineering Center where I've sent them all the parts I've taken out of people over my 26-year practice, and we've learned a lot from that. And I don't think anybody ever went out to design a bad implant or an implant that would poison an individual.
No.
But when you're talking a multi-billion-dollar industry where that's been their primary material that they've used, I think we're dealing with a phenomena that Margaret Heffernan would call willful blindness, in the book she wrote called Willful Blindness. And when that much is at stake and you're that invested in the technology, it's very, very difficult for you to see the warts.
Well, why can't they just, you mentioned earlier ceramics is usable, but it's much more expensive. In that you had mentioned in the last show that before they went to chrome cobalt, they were using, I think, stainless steel. Is stainless steel that much more expensive than chrome cobalt that it wouldn't make?
No, that's the amusing thing is if you look at total joint registry data from England, Wales, New Zealand, Australia, the Scandinavian countries, United States has never had a national total joint registry. We get far better data from other countries. And if you really distill everything we know from total joint registries is the less expensive implants perform better.
Uh-huh.
So my go-to hip for all ages of patients is a stainless steel cemented stem with a stainless steel head articulating on polyethylene. And I can either cement the polyethylene into the socket, or I can use a polyethylene liner in a titanium alloy socket. And that particular hip has the lowest failure rate of any studied implant in the civilized world over a period of 30 years.
So why don't we, from a standpoint of an operation and cost for an operation, stuff like that, you can certainly, that doesn't necessarily have to change. It's going to take as long to put in a stainless steel artificial hip as it would a ceramic or something else. I mean, that part, I can understand how the device may be different in cost, and maybe that's where the challenge gets, or is it just that we kind of want to do newer is better? I mean, what's...
Oh yeah, this is in many ways a problem in the United States, and unfortunately the rest of the world follows the United States. My opinion is arthroprosthetics in the United States is market-driven instead of science-driven. And unfortunately, I mean, I'm looking pretty good through all this because I kind of figured it out. But until my hip had been redone and my symptoms had resolved, and until I got into the weeds with looking into the FDA process for implant approval, in medical school and in, my 15 years of practice before I had my own hip, I assumed that these devices were tested in people before they were released to me as a surgeon to implant them.
Yeah.
I had this assumption that they were safe and they were studied. And the fact of the matter is, for medical devices, that is seldom done.
Wow.
And for arthroprosthetics, it's probably less than 1% of the devices have had any sort of human trials before they're released to market. And anyone who's listening to the show who's interested in that, watch The Bleeding Edge.
Yeah, that was great movie.
They have Dr. Kessler, ex-head of the FDA under President Bush, saying outright they got it wrong.
They got it wrong.
Medical devices. It's a much less rigorous process than it is for pharmaceuticals.
Right. Dr. Tower, we've reached the end of another half hour. Do you believe that? It's just time
flies.
It does. And we have to end off, but I'm going to ask you if maybe at some future date, maybe we can reconnect and kind of, because there's more here than we've been able to touch on in this this 2 30-minute segments. But I really want to thank you for joining us today. And the information, I think, is invaluable. I hope the people who are watching are taking this to heart. I didn't mention it earlier, but if you have any questions, send them in to info@referencepointtv.com. I'll share them with Dr. Tower. His website, I think we broadcast a few times. You can go up on his website and there's information there. This is an important thing for people to understand. I personally know, I don't know, 15 or 20 people that have had implants in the last few years, in the last 5, 10 years. So this is something that resonates with me as well. So they're telling me that we're at a point where I need to sign off. So Dr. Tower, again, thank you so much for joining us. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next time at Reference Point.